So if you would, let's pick up with verse 1 with chapter 18. We start off with David numbering the people who were with him, and he set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. And then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab. And we're going to see the thirds here that are split up. Joab, basically his general. 1/3 under the hand of Abishai. And Abishai is the guy who went with David down on that special mission where Saul's camp was. That one person that went with David where they picked up his javelin and his water bucket. Abishai is that one guy that has remained faithful, and now he's been put over a charge of 1/3 of David's military. And in addition to that, Ittai, the Gittite. I'm not synced, am I? That's my fault. Hang on one second. Sanctuary. So, Ittai the Gittite. So we have this last person who just came on the scene as David was departing Jerusalem, who's not somebody who is from the 12 tribes. He's a Gentile, but a person. So we have really a range here. Joab is the general that's been with David since the beginning. Abishai came while they were fleeing and they were in those years. But then this last person really just came in these last days. The degree, though, of Ittai's faithfulness, the degree in which David is able to trust him and rely on him, ends up putting him in a place where he gives him 1/3 of his troops. And that really just kind of reminds me just a little bit about how Jesus was talking about those workers and the people who were there from the beginning and the people who just came in right towards the end, and the wage that they received being equal. And how sometimes if somebody is faithful, even though they might come in late, the Lord might use that person for a very significant thing, a very significant thing. 1/3 of all of the military in this very desperate situation being trusted to a Gentile who had tremendous faith. So it makes me think about the people that are around us and those who are faithful and those who are reliable, those who are trustworthy with such things. But we're going to talk about the pit here a little bit. And since chapter 15, here's just some of the things that David has been experiencing, because we talked a lot about discouragement. We talked about some hardships that David has been going through. David went through things like heartbreak, the pain of seeing a family member rise up in revolt against him. There was shock in Absalom's ability to secretly gather support and challenge his authority. There was betrayal, his own son having turned against him. There was fear for his life and those who were loyal to him. There was shame, humiliation of fleeing his own kingdom. There was grief of leaving home and city, the sight of his people weeping for him. So just keep in mind, David's leaving, and all the people around him are just weeping about these things. He was vulnerable because David's high-level strategist was now moving to harm him. There was betrayal there as well, where someone trusted to the intimate affairs of national security who knew all the secrets. There was grief, leaving home and city. Oh, that's the same one. There was cursing from Shimei, which led to humiliation, being openly ridiculed and insulted, restraint, accepting that God allowed the cursing, and resignation, possibly feeling that he deserved this treatment for past sins. And then we move on to Absalom becoming king, where maybe David was feeling rejection because the people didn't want him anymore. condemnation because the nation has been given to another because of me. Disgraced, Absalom takes David's concubines publicly. And then there's that army that's out to get him. Remember, we're looking for an army that is as numerous as the sand to overwhelm David. Massive army that was set out against him. Anxiety, I have a few in number, few resources against a nation. And disrespect, David would not move against the Lord's anointed. So there's a lot of things that David's going through from chapter 15. I don't think this is exhaustive, but if we're just pulling some of these things, a little bit here and a little bit there, there's about 15 of those things. And I want to take a look at this because going back to that theme of discouragement and everything, I want you to think about what puts you in the pit. How you end up getting there. Is it something like anxiety that brings you down? I'm sure betrayal is huge for anyone. Feeling condemned, being disgraced, disrespected, especially publicly. Fear and grief. Heartbreak, humiliation. Rejection, resignation. Basically, resignation, think about giving up, just to the point of giving up. Restraint, shame, shock, and being vulnerable. Any one of these things can be an iceberg, right? But all these together puts David in a very tough season of his life, a very, very challenging place. And I want to reference when we're in such things, in pits like this, I had to go back to something that David said himself. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. I think this is so important because while all of us may have been in the pit before, it can be a very challenging thing to change your mind about, to be rescued from that pit, to escape, to get out of that pit. And I like how David even references in this psalm this slimy pit, this place that he's in that he can't really rescue himself from. And so he's crying out to the Lord, and just the fact that he's referencing the Lord turning to me, hearing my cry, lifting me up and out of this. This is something that I really felt like I wanted to challenge all of us with. The next time we're facing discouragement, the next time we're going through any one of these things that are on this list of 15 things, that we take these things to the Lord. David's in a bad place, but he's already begun to come back to the place of leading with those captains, with those leaders. And he's shaken because he's just a man. But he's a man who is dependent on the Lord. And we see different glimpses of that in different times and different seasons. Some more so, and honestly, some we don't even see him inquiring. But I do want to just reference that psalm and how David handles really just being in the pits, because we all have been there before. He goes on to say, I will surely go out with you myself. And I want to reference with this the idea of regrets. I don't know about you guys, but one of the best ways that I learn is from my own mistakes. In fact, if we're going to make mistakes, we might as well learn from them, right? David made a mistake that he's still living with and dealing with this whole context of Absalom and the rebellion, all going back to the sin with Bathsheba and Uriah. It all kind of started with the people being out to war and David not being with them. I'm not going to say that something like that was never going to happen, but it wouldn't have happened at that time in that place. If David was somewhere else, it would have just removed him from the temptation. It would have removed him from the situation and the possibilities of what could have happened. So here, David is saying, I'm going to go with you guys this time. Last time I didn't, and this time I want to go with you. So sometimes we have regrets about the things that happened, things that didn't go well, and sometimes we need to learn from that lesson and we need to change course. Now, in this situation, the people answered, and they say, you shall not go out. For if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor if half of us die, will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now, for you are now more help to us in this city. So the people are speaking pretty strongly to their king, and they're saying, you have to stay here. In that situation in times past, maybe that would have worked. Maybe that would have been better. But in this situation here, that's not going to work. So one thing I think is important is how we share feedback with those who are in positions of authority. You might remember a saying that, well, it's a saying that has been said at this pulpit, I don't know how many decades now. But certainly when we went through the Servanthood 101 series, there was a saying of advise strongly and what? Yeah, good job. Advise strongly, submit fully. Advise strongly, if I'm having to make a decision and I think A is going to be the best course of action, and let's say the people think B is the best course of action, I'm going to have my bias towards A. I'm going to really need to see the things that I'm missing. So if it's kind of like, oh, okay, if he wants A, let's just do A. That's not really going to be beneficial. I really, really want, this chapter is really going to really touch up on just kind of being agreeable and not agreeable. We have agreeable people, and then we have Joab. Maybe one of the epitomes of not agreeable, and certainly in this chapter. The people here are not being agreeable with David's plan for the well-being of David. So they're giving feedback, and it's strong feedback. They're advising strongly, and I don't see any reason to think that they're not submitting fully here. The king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. And this is where I want to reference a leader who listens. It matters if we're servants or if we're in positions where people have authority over us, and we feel like if we share something, it doesn't really matter. It has an impact, right? So if we have leaders that do listen, hear us when we advise strongly, and we're okay if they go a different direction. But I know that leaders are appreciative when they hear things that change the course and the actions that they have, because things need to take place and things need to happen that they're not seeing. A good leader listens. Listens. Now, some of you might be thinking, I have never been, nor probably ever will be, the king of Israel, but we all have different capacities of leadership. If you've ever been a parent, sometimes with friends, sometimes with situations with work, how can we be good leaders that listen? Because sometimes it's going to be a very important thing. In this situation, it's life and death. David, you can't go with us because they'll just be out there to kill you. We won't even matter. So sometimes it's going to be life and death, and David listens here. Not being stubborn, there's wisdom. Verse 5 says, now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. I don't think any of us are really strangers to Absalom and to the story, but I'm going to recap some things here. Absalom is, at this point, David's oldest son. David had an older son. Absalom murdered him out of vengeance for his sister that was raped. So Amnon, the oldest son of David, was murdered by Absalom. We have this situation where he ran away, he was in exile for a while, he ends up coming back to Jerusalem, David's not seeing him, then they have reconciliation. I don't really know how it went from reconciliation to treason, but it did. And I don't think David knows how it did either. But do you guys have like a situation where you have your own children and something really bad happened and you're like, I know my kid and I don't exactly know what was going on, but I know that they're a good kid, and if I could just talk with them or reason with them or something. And I think David is in a really tough position. Listen, guys, I have been very challenged by this kind of content. I thought Judges was hard. In some ways, I think Judges is just black and white. I have dealt with such contention with these last chapters of 2 Samuel, sometimes just trying to figure out which way is up. Sometimes trying to figure out, was David right here? Was someone else right here? And as we've talked before, we're kind of in a situation where some chapters everyone's wrong. One of the things I see with David here, I can look at this and I can see weakness. I can look at this and I can see a person who's completely missing his role as the commander of the Lord's army. But one thing I have to say, I see a father. And it's complicated and it's difficult, but David never stops being a father in this chapter. So he's asking, please. I know what's at stake here. I know what's going on. But please be gentle with my son. We've talked about faithful men before. We've talked about how in this chapter there's 3 people that David has put his trust in. But it's also a little bit ironic, because if we think about those faithful men, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, Joab has an interesting record there. At this point, Joab also has murdered somebody. He's been responsible for a little bit of trickery in regards to the woman who came to kind of help restore things between David and Absalom. So how faithful are these 3 really? And this is where sometimes, I don't know, I was just thinking about times when I've had teams and I kind of knew the characters of the people I was picking for responsibilities. It could have been anything as simple as volleyball or something as complicated as ministry. But sometimes you know you're picking characters. This person's an interesting character. Now, if things go well with this character, this could be great. But it may not necessarily go well, because there are markers and I have seen signs that this person could become a problem. So faithful men is one of the things that we are going to be looking at tonight, and then also priorities. Like right here with David, he has priorities as a father, but he also has priorities as a king. He has priorities to his servants, to the army, to those who are back in Israel that they're trying to rescue, so on and so forth. The last words to David's troops, I mean, it wasn't something like Godspeed and be safe and be well and be gentle with my son Absalom. That's where his priorities are at. Verse 6 says, "So the people went out into the field of battle against Israel." So everything we were avoiding before, civil war is now upon us. The battle was in the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel overthrown there before the servants of David. A great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. So we may not have had a great slaughter in Israel or Jerusalem, but we've just lost 20,000 people. That's a huge number. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. You know, commentaries didn't really help with this too much. In fact, one of the commentaries said, I had a picture in my head of Lord of the Rings and the Ents coming alive and swatting at people. And I was like, creative, but that's not helping me understand what's going on here. It seems like they're in these woods that have enough peril to them as it is. This is a wilderness that they're in here. So in some situations, maybe they're falling down cliffs, there's pits. I am not saying that on the microphone. That would be inconceivable. But one of the things that I realized, and this honestly right here was some of the greatest clarity I had in a very confusing chapter. Lord, where are you? Well, when I read the part about more people were devoured by the woods, it made me think of the way that God does battle and the way that God has his victories. What does God want me to know about the battle? Well, here's something that David said when he was a wee lad. This was actually the very last thing that he said to Goliath when he let him have it verbally. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. That's what he said to Goliath. Last line. And I think we're kind of familiar with the idea that the battle is the Lord's. But if we were, why do we freak out so much? Like, we know that here in this building. We might even sing those songs. Here we have a situation where the Lord took care of business through his own supernatural means. So I could kind of see the way the Lord was working here, even if I was having confusion as to which person was right and who should have been doing things. But moving right along here, that idea of the battle being the Lord's, then Absalom met the servants of David. Now we have Absalom introduced into this story at this point. He's inserted into the battle here. He's riding on a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth, and the mule which was under him went on. In this one moment, really kind of everything is hanging in the balance. The person who had been plotting and strategizing this treason, again, the woods come into effect here and sees Absalom. I'm going to ruin this for you guys really quick. You ready? Where does it say that his hair got caught in the branches? If it got ruined for me, I'm going to ruin it for you too. Because forever, I have always seen Absalom dangling by his hair, and he may have. He may have. All I'm saying is, in the Hebrew and in those translations that properly represent it accurately, it doesn't say that he's dangling by his hair. In fact, one of my favorite commentators, Adam Clark, he believes that his neck was wedged between the bows, these big branches. So it'd almost be like he was caught by his neck, hanging by his head. And different commentators had different ideas as to how that made more sense or didn't make sense. If he was hanging by his hair, couldn't he just take his sword out and cut his hair down? Well, not if he was too prideful, because we know his hair had a once-a-year haircut, and maybe it wasn't time, so maybe that's why he didn't do that. But maybe it was tight, right? Maybe there were braids. Maybe things were tighter and it caught tighter. It doesn't matter. What we know here is we have a very, very unique situation, very interesting scenario, where Absalom is basically completely defeated before any of David's men take hold of him. He's as vulnerable as the head of an army could be, as a king could be. So this is where we see Absalom. And I think the reason why we see him here is because there is someone who has been anointed by God, and Absalom was not him. And if you guys remember, David was very adamant about not touching the Lord's anointed. And Absalom did not get that message from his dad. And Absalom is out there with the army to try to cause harm and to defeat his own dad and that movement, those people who are loyal to him. But the Lord is going to get done what the Lord intends to get done. And that's why I'm really thankful for something like this. It's not a random arrow or something like that, like we had with Saul. We have something where the Lord really just uses his own creation to turn the tide of battle, to take hold and to capture a king. It's really incredible. Now, a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. And for just a second, appreciate that, right? We're out here doing serious battle. And somebody comes over and is like, I think, yeah, it was the most beautiful man I've ever seen in my entire life hanging from a tree. And Joab said, you saw him? And the guy said, Joab continues, he says, why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt, because that was a really, really big deal back then. This is the first time that we actually see Joab's agenda publicly deviate from David's. So we're talking about priorities earlier, and David laid out his priorities to the commanders, and I know that Joab heard it. I also know that this guy heard it because he goes on to tell us. The man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware. Now that right there, that's the first imperative that we have in the whole chapter. That verb is a command. Beware, lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise, I would have dealt falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. So what he's saying is, you're the king's general. This would put me in jeopardy and harm, and you yourself, under his authority, would be after me. I'm going to give you guys a real hot take here. In fact, I was just thinking about this. I don't know if I'm going to come back and teach this chapter the same 10 years from now. And I already prefaced it by saying I'm pretty confused about some things here. But as I've been sitting with this, I've been trying to weigh things in the balance and figure things out. And I almost pulled this, but then I thought, I can't. I got to leave this in here. And I have him referenced as a yes man. And here's why. There's things that Joab does not necessarily follow David's direction on. And David hasn't always been good at dealing with correction to Joab, because maybe Joab is family. I mean, not maybe. Joab is 100% family, And David doesn't always seem to do well with correcting within his family. If it's outside the family, if it's somebody who's threatening Saul or something like that, David is really good to bring justice. In his own house, not so much. We already had problems that have arisen with Absalom, but not to this level. Nowhere near this level. As bad as murder is, it's not the same thing as complete, total treason. Taking over the nation from the Lord's anointed. Setting out to kill your countrymen. This is high treason. This is a whole different level. This is a whole different kind of problem. David wanted him to be handled gently. It's almost unfathomable for us to think of someone who is responsible for such a vulnerable attack on our country to be handled with gently. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about if there was a president that instead of going after Osama bin Laden as the most wanted man on the planet with the best military teams and technology the world has ever seen after him, if instead the president said, please be gentle with my dear Osama, I don't know how long that person would be in office. In fact, I don't know if we might have military commanders and generals who might think twice about who is in office and if there needs to be something done about the person that's in office. But this person heard the command, and he said, that's what my king said. And he was going to be faithful to it. And I think there should be credit due that guy. In fact, in one sense, I would make the case very, very easily that this person is much more faithful to the king than Joab is, his own general. Not a hard case to make. But here's my question. What uncomfortable things do we say yes to? Sometimes there's people in positions that are in authority over us, and sometimes we're asked to do things that might start getting into gray area. Maybe it even starts to cross the line. And I kind of think that Absalom is one of those situations, because the law tells us how Absalom needed to be handled. The law tells us from the murder that he committed how he needed to be dealt with justice, and that didn't even necessarily mean death. There was a whole process that was built into the law for somebody who took the life of another person, and then for them to flee into a city for asylum so that the people can hear the case and go over things, but that there would be an immediate protection from that person being having vengeance sought after them. The concubines and other things. Deal gently with this man. And then the other question came into, when should we not say yes? When does it cross the line? And this is where I've struggled, because we've got David, and I will say this, guys. Sometimes I've heard people who handled the word of God, and they either really like to joke around at the apostles' expense, often Peter and stuff like that. And I don't know that these guys realize we're going to meet each other one day, and that's going to be an awkward day for some of them. So I try to stay away from those things, and I try to really give benefit of the doubt, especially to Peter and all the others. But I'm having a hard time with David. I'm having a hard time with David because of some of the mistakes that have already been made, the way that he has placed his own children, his daughter in jeopardy, his sons in jeopardy. When should we not say yes? When should we contend more? When do we need to draw the line with some things? And I think it's always clear when there's sin. Well, we have sin. Well, what about reconciliation? Some of these things are challenging. Joab said, I cannot linger with you. That's the last thing that Joab says before he takes 3 spears in his hand and he thrusts them through Absalom's heart. While he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree, and 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. So Joab's armor bearers, 10, finished the job after 3 spears are plunged into Absalom's heart. And I will say this, just out of sheer cosmic type justice. One of the commentators I came across made an emphasis to the 10 armor bearers that delivered the final blows to Joab, each one somewhat representing the 10 concubines that Absalom took for himself. We have justice to a person who is responsible for murder, rape, and treason. I mean, there's misdemeanors, there's felonies, and then there's treason. This one situation came to mind, and if you have been around my teachings enough, you know I'll try to find the benefit of the doubt in some areas. And Joab, I've been trying. I've really been trying to find the benefit of the doubt because he's an interesting, stubborn general. But when I put it that way, I'm like, oh, that sounds a lot like me. So I'm looking at this situation, and it reminded me of a case in Numbers. It's in Numbers chapter 25. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to Israel's judges, each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped. This was a priest. But there had been idolatry that was going on in the camp. And it was something that the Lord was incensed about. Actually was bringing about a plague onto the Israelites because of this idolatry. And here we have this Israelite man who's bringing in a Gentile, a pagan worshiping Gentile, to sleep with her in broad daylight, just like we have this other situation. No one gives Phinehas the command. Phinehas just knows this has to stop. And this holy man takes a spear and ends their life, but also simultaneously ends the plague as well. And the Lord references Phinehas' faithfulness right after this, crediting him for his actions and preserving Israel, moving them forward. In that sense, I see the same kind of thing happening with Joab and Absalom. I see Joab ending this cycle that has been continuing, which really has been like a plague on Israel. It does not seem that that was David's intention. And here's the thing. I don't know that we really have clarity in Scripture. We don't have any reference in Psalms or the New Testament or in Proverbs as to this action that Joab had. In fact, a little spoiler alert, this is actually kind of a big spoiler, especially if you're big Joab fans, so my apologies. But as David is giving his last commands to his son Solomon, as Solomon is about to take over the kingdom, one of the last things he says is, oh, hey, by the way, Joab, you have to take care of Joab. You have to administer justice for the 2 murders that he committed. But those 2 murders were not in regards to Absalom. They were in regards to people that he murdered in peacetime. One which took place way before this, and one which will take place in a couple of chapters from now. So I don't exactly know if from God's perspective, this was just completely evil. I certainly know he was defying authority. I know that. And another thing I know is that when we ever are in a situation where we defy authority, we have to know and understand that there's probably going to be consequences that go along with that. If I end up having to take a stand against authority because I feel like it is the thing to do according to the kingdom of God, according to the law of God, Absalom should have been put to death. But to defy the king, that is a very, very bold thing to do. So any kind of defiance, we have to weigh and consider who we are serving with that. Because if I'm using the word defiance, more often than not, I'm serving myself. It's very rare that defiance is unto the King of Kings. It's a very rare thing. And I don't exactly think that that's what Joab is doing here. I really don't think that Joab is like, no. There's a law here that God's given us, and we're going to live by that law. Because that wasn't Joab. Joab wasn't a godly man. But I think he was sizing things up, and he was saying, no way. This guy's not coming back into the kingdom. Verse 16 says, so Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom. They cast him into a large pit in the woods and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. Now this thing right here, they cast him into a large pit in the woods, laid very large stones over him. I'm just going to go back to that reference of Osama bin Laden. After he was removed from this planet, his body was put into the deep, so that it was gone and could never be retrieved again. And that is essentially what's happening here in this situation. We don't want Absalom to become another event and another thing. He needs to go away. And so they put him into the depth of the earth and make it so that he is never going to be brought back. Because that was a common thing to do, to go and get the bones and to bring them back into the homeland and to bury them with the family and things like that. And Joab is taking some very, very strong positions here, and he is completely removing David's opportunity to ever be with Joab ever again. Now, Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it's called Absalom's monument. Absalom actually, according to genealogies, had 2 sons. It's believed, it's very possible, that they did not survive to this point, and so he's making a monument in regards to who he is to other people, which brings up the title and the conversation of legacy. Legacy. I'm not sure how many of you guys have your own monuments set up in different areas of Oklahoma or wherever you're from originally. But if you were to do that, I just know there's some kids in that neighborhood, like who I was when I was growing up, and they're going to egg that thing, and they're going to put shaving cream on it, especially this month. They don't care who you think you are. And when it comes to legacy, the only thing that really matters is the legacy that you have based on how you lived, not how nice of a monument you can create for yourself in your own life because of the narrative that you want to present to other people. How we live is what we will be known for. Just like I said, we're going to meet these people in heaven. I tell you what, I have a funny feeling we're all going to sit down one day and hear Eutychus's testimony, because he's like, guys, I'm so sick of the reputation. Like, I'm more than just a guy who fell out of a window one night. That's all we know, though. You know what I mean? That's all we know. I also heard an interesting quote that I felt like I don't know how much it plays here, but if someone were to read a book about our life, would it change somebody else's life? And if we talk about a legacy being based on the things that we do in this life, I asked one person that question. I said, hey, if someone were to read a book about your life, how many lives would it change? And the person said, absolutely none. We have some work to do. Verse 19 says, then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run now and take the news to the king. Okay, I'm just going to say this. This guy, up until now, he's been a very critical part of the information and the relay that's been going back and forth from what's going on in the inside of the new administration under Absalom out to David's forces so that they can get the intel. But this guy here, I don't know how old he is, but he just seems like a kid, okay? And he's like, let me run. Let me go do this thing. Let me share how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies. And Joab said to him, you shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead. And I think Joab is like, hey, buddy, this is not good news. You don't want to be the runner for this. That's just my take on this. Then Joab said to the Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, but whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. Like, all I care about, I bought new sneakers, I really want to run. Whatever happens, just let me go do this. So Joab said, why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready? And he said this again, whatever happens, let me run. And so Joab said to him with the authoritative command, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. And this just made me think about a person. Maybe you know him, maybe you've heard of him. Eric Liddell, who lived a long time ago, passed away in 1945 in a Japanese prison camp. He was a Scottish sprinter, rugby player, and Christian missionary born in King China to Scottish missionary parents. He attended boarding school near London, spending time when possible with his family in Edinburgh, and afterwards attended the University of Edinburgh. At the 1924 Summer Olympics in Paris, Liddell refused to run in the heats for his favored 100 meters because they were held on Sunday. Instead, he competed in the 400 meters held on a weekday and a race that he won. He returned to China in 1925 and served as a missionary teacher. Aside from 2 furloughs in Scotland, he remained in China until his death in a Japanese civilian internment camp in 1945. Liddell's Olympic training and racing and the religious convictions that influenced him are depicted in the Oscar-winning 1981 film Chariots of Fire. This guy, I would definitely recommend looking up Eric Liddell. Here's just a quote on how intense this guy was. The secret of my success over the 400 meters, because keep in mind, he trained for the 100. Look, I can maybe run 100 meters. I'm not running 400. There's a big difference training for 100 versus 400. I run the first 200 as fast as I can, then for the second 200, with God's help, I run faster. This was a very, very passionate man who had strong convictions in regards to his faith. Enough to say, everything I've been training for, everything leading up to this, it's on a Sunday? I can't do it. And if I remember correctly, I believe on that Sunday, he preached in church. Another thing he said is, I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. And I just love that quote. So my question is, just like Ahimaaz, what has God made me? Because he made Eric Liddell fast. 1 Corinthians 12:27 says, now you are part of that body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. What did he make me? What has he made me to be? What has he given me to be faithful in? Coming back to Joab for a moment. Again, I'm trying here with Joab. One of the things we say in church is find out what God is doing and get behind it. Well, God made Ahimaaz fast with a desire and a passion to run, and Joab got behind it, and that's just good leadership, getting behind the things that people have been gifted by God in. And so Joab just gives the command for him to go and running. David is sitting between the two gates when we find the scene moving over to verse 24. The watchman went up to the roof over the gate to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. My question is, what is David looking for? The king is sitting between these two gates. This is where we left him. And his last words had to do with his son. And when we find him again, he's still in the same place. This question never gets old. What is David seeking here? How do we see his whole life steered towards what it is that he's seeking? Because that is the way this works, and that is how it works for us as well. The things that we are seeking steer our whole life towards that direction. The watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, there is another man running alone. And the king said, he also brings news. So the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he's a good man, and he comes with good news. This guy has such a fun reputation. So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, all is well. And then he bowed with his face to the earth before the king and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. The king said, is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servants and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about. Translation, I don't know. Like, that's basically what it comes down to. I don't know. And the king said, this is the only thing that David says in a commanding manner as the king in the whole chapter. So he takes this young lad and he just says, turn aside and stand here. Because basically, like, he had all this energy and you have brought me nothing. Like, I just wanted one thing and you don't have it. So he turned aside and he stood still. And I just think this part right here, stood still, like the Lord wanted us to know that that was a feat. Like that was an accomplishment for this person to get here to do this. But it also reminded me when we feel like we need to say something. So here's how I want to direct this. You may not run through cities and towns and valleys and everything else to go tell somebody something. But sometimes there is a great deal of effort on our part to say something. And it's usually occurring while someone else is talking. And so when someone else is talking and we have this strong desire, I've got to say this thing, I just think this person is a good reminder that the thing that we labored so much over to bring out may not really be important. And we need to be still and just be okay with that. So the Cushite comes and says, There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you. And the king said to the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? The Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. Then the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son. And my question is, why does David want to trade places with Absalom? When I was considering this chapter, and I was considering David's faults in previous chapters in the season of his life with his own son Absalom, something I couldn't shake on this one was, I think I might have just seen a glimpse of David waiting at the gate for his prodigal son to return. Because if you remember previously, that wasn't his heart towards his son. His son comes back and David says, don't bring him in my presence. And that went on for years. And now we have David, he's just at the gate, not wanting the same mistake, not wanting a situation where his son's not going to come home again. And I got to give credit to David on that one for that. The thing is, I don't know if it was because he was too old at this point and couldn't go into battle and all that kind of stuff. But, I was thinking about how David could have said, hey, guys, listen, I need a garrison around me. I need some special forces. I need some guys that could get me in there because I just need to try to meet my son on the battlefield. I have not even talked to him since he asked me if he could go leave Jerusalem so he could go make sacrifices and make good on his promise to the Lord. And then all this stuff started. I haven't even talked to him. Let me just try to talk to him. It also reminded me, so it was when the days of feasting had run their course that Job would send and sanctify them, his children, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. Job made those efforts. Job tried to resolve these things. Job was trying to reason together. And maybe David is in a place where he's just a little bit late on what can be done. Now, with chapter 19, we have just the finishing touches of this story. It says, Job was told, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. I don't think we can appreciate this as much as we need to. That right there is a shocking statement. I don't even know what to really if we're going to stick with the Osama bin Laden thing for just a second, imagine that we were getting news reports and tweets back in whatever year that was. I think it was 29, 10, 11, somewhere in there when we got that report that Osama bin Laden had been killed. And just imagine instead of that, right after that, it said, and President Obama is weeping and crying because. This is a huge statement that the king is weeping about the battle we just had over the enemy of Israel. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. They didn't have the victory that they should have had. The people heard it, said that day, the king is grieved for his son. And the people stole back into the city that day as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. But the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. Now, when it says here, the people who are ashamed steal away, I've looked into that because that's not a phrase that we're really common with. And what it's talking about there is when someone would take something and flee, that kind of degree of concealment. Everyone who was out there and rejoicing over the victory that they had, well, they're now fleeing away as though, we got to get out of here. This isn't right. And I do see a father's heart again, broken for what can't be fixed in this world. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants, who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters," because you don't just have one son, you have a family, you have multiples. "The lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you well." This is maybe the most brash thing that we see Joab ever say. But he's seeing something that he's knowing, this can't go down like this. This isn't right. You've got to be thinking in different terms. You've got to be thinking like a king. Going back to our priorities. In Matthew, Jesus gives this example and says, "But what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, 'Son, go work in my vineyard.' He answered and said, 'I will not.' But afterward he regretted it and went. Then he came to the second and said likewise, and he answered and said, 'I go, sir.' But he did not go." So the first one regretted, changed his mind, and went. The second one did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? They said to him, "The first." Makes sense, right? Jesus said to them, "Assuredly I say to you, tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you." Joab's not the only person who is using strong language and pictures. And here's what I was seeing with this. David is very broken about his son, but his son was trying to kill his father, take over the kingdom. And Joab is saying, these guys are your family. These are the ones who care about you. These are the ones who risk their life for you. And in the same kind of sense, they need to have appreciation. They need to be rejoiced over. They need to have love. And this is a challenge for us because we're going to have some people who are our really, really, really close friends, but they don't get everything right. We're going to have some family members, and they don't get everything right. This is where I think we have to be really careful about bias. We have to be really careful about the things that are natural to us that we want to gravitate towards. We want to be on team my family or my best friends. But sometimes it really just comes down to who does the right thing. And that's what Jesus is bringing out as a point. It's not what people say, it's what they do. "Now, therefore, arise, go out, and speak comfort to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night, and that will be worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now." And this is a credit to both of them, actually, because there is a direction for correction that's presented by Joab that is beneficial and necessary. Joab knows what it's like to command people. He knows what it's like to be a leader. And here he's seeing the leader of leaders missing some cues. Correction is here because every leader is going to make mistakes, except for one. There's only one leader that does not make mistakes. All the rest of them are going to fail you. You, me, sometimes it's going to be me. But we're going to fail in these things. If we can receive correction, we can grow from these things. We can take things that didn't go well, sometimes even tragedies, and we can see the Lord redeem those things. But there's only one that's not going to fail you. Let's pray. Lord, again, just so much tonight with all the turmoil that's going on here. And it's almost like the storms that we are hearing about, that we've been having land in our southeast. Some of these things have to get worse before they get better. Some of these things have to go through their course. And I just don't think that there was a way that Absalom was coming back from this. And I do think that you had prepared for him to be captured, for this treason and this rebellion that he was leading to end supernaturally, and also to continue to protect your anointed. And so, Lord, I want to ask that you would help to lead us through the truth of these stories and the principles, the things that you want us to know. Every little detail, whether it's somebody that's a jumpy runner that just needs to be still for a moment, or the things that we can redeem with the time that we have as fathers, and the way that we can extend grace, wait at the gates, because maybe our situation isn't the same as David's. Maybe it's not as dire. Maybe it's not as futile. But Lord, thank you that you are a good Father who is always waiting for us, who is ready to renew us, that nothing will be too far for us to be saved from. And I ask, Lord, that you can continue to lead us in wisdom and in truth, that we don't have to have generals barking at us, that we can hear that gentle, quiet spirit that you speak to us in. And Lord, I just want to pray that we would be faithful and that we would respond to that. In Jesus' name, amen.